Hang on, it's setting it up. There we go. Okay, so, there's a lot more people in the waiting room. Hang on, admit all of them. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Julie Zuckerman, author of the Book of Jeremiah, and I'm excited to welcome you to the January Literary Modiin author event. Before I introduce today's authors, I want to take a minute to tell you about Literary Modiin. For those of you who aren't familiar, Modiin is a planned city in Israel about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's not far from the airport, even though the airport is closed right now. But when it reopens, please come and visit the next time you're here. We have a large population of English speakers in Modiin. So about a year and a half ago, right after my book came out, I started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to the large community of English readers. And there are lots of, through that, I met different book clubs and a writing group, and that's how I met Sarah, who's one of our authors tonight. And we held several in-person events, but when the pandemic hit, we switched to a virtual format, which has been great. It's been one of the silver linings of the pandemic, I have to say, because we've been able to hear from authors from all over, mostly in the States, and some in Israel, and we've been able to welcome attendees from all over. You can see, let me see where I'm pointing to. In my, to my left or right, I can't tell what I'm pointing to. The stack of books next to me are books of all the authors we've hosted. So check those out when you get a chance if you haven't read them already. And some of those authors are here today. So thank you. Erica, I think, is here, and R.L. Mazies, and Miriam Sivan. I'm not sure who else, and if I missed you, I'm sorry. So the format of today's event is that each author will be speaking for 15 minutes or so, and then we open it up to questions. We have a large attendance, so everybody's on mute, and you should put your questions in the chat box. And if you have any technical difficulties, also put those in the chat box. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our first author, and I'm just going to go in the order that I read your book. So Amy, you can go first. Amy Schern is the author of 3 novels, most recently Unseen City, which was published by Red Hen Press in 2020. She's the senior editor at the medium publication Forge, a fiction editor at Joyland Magazine, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, Slate, and many literary publications. Amy lives in Brooklyn with her 2 children. So Amy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Julie. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you guys all for being here. Hi, Mom, etc. And I'm so happy to meet these other authors. I'm so excited about your books. Okay, can you guys hear me okay? I'm gonna read just a little tiny bit of Unseen City. This is a novel about a haunted house in Brooklyn, and that's all you need to know for what I'm going to read you right now. It's going to be the tiniest little reading. Okay. Of course, Meg's wasn't the only haunted house in the city that never rests. There was a house I once knew well on Holland Avenue. If you could wrench off the front and peer in at the resulting dollhouse, you would see the stacked stories. On a sticky summer evening, for example, as new renters attempted to settle into the sepulchral apartment downstairs, a new couple, arranging themselves in their first shared home, arguing over whose desk should go where in the office off the kitchen, which suddenly seemed drafty, didn't it? Should they contact the landlord or tape the windows, or why was it so cold in there midsummer? Why was the window always sliding shut, the door always slamming open? It was his fault, she insisted, and he countered, no, it was her fault. And why did they both feel so weird? It couldn't just be the move, could it? The apartment gave them an ominous chill every now and then for no apparent reason. Was it a mistake to move in together? Was that it? Or the neighborhood, was it still too marginal? They were so close to the projects after all. Whatever the reason, they both felt angered, stirred up, not entirely themselves. Okay, that's all I'm going to read. So this book, I'm going to take a vote. You guys, is it more interesting to hear about this book or writing? I've written 4 novels, writing novels in general. Whoever answers first. Does anyone care? Do you have a preference? Which is more interesting? Book. All right. Ah, it's a tie, writing in general. All right. So I've been thinking, you guys are useless. Get it together. Everybody's got a different thing. Okay. No, that's my fault. I asked for it. Okay, so I'll talk about both. So I've been thinking a lot about, because it's funny, literary publishing is like so slow, really. This book came out in September, and my agent is tomorrow sending out my next book because there's such a gap and I'm not super productive. It's just there's like such a gap in how long it takes to publish a book. So I've been thinking a lot about that next book and how it's very different than this book and how each of my 4 books has been really the process has been really different. And I always think it's interesting to hear about writers' process because I don't know, sometimes it makes it feel more like, and a lot of you I think are writers, but it's like hearing somebody talk about writing a book makes it seem like writing a book is just another thing that people do, which is true. And anyone can do it really. And I've been thinking a lot about how each of my books is really shaped by the time and places in which I had to write them. And maybe you guys who are writers can relate. I actually wrote a short essay about this that I can drop in the chat later if that's interesting. But my first book I wrote, well, my first book was not published. It was the one I wrote in my MFA program, which I think everybody has that first book they write that's not really your first book, but is like your training wheels book. I feel like David might have a different story. He's gonna be like, this, I just wrote this book. It's no big deal. And it just is, here we go. But for me, David, I had to write actually a couple books before I learned how to write a book. So then that first book that got published, I was working full-time in New York City, and the only time I could find to carve out was early mornings. So I would wake up in the early morning and write before I had done anything. I wouldn't check anything. I wouldn't, I'd have coffee, I think, and then just sit at my desk and write. And I think that book really holds that imprint of that time. It's like a little bit of a dreamy book. It was definitely written without contacting or being aware of the outside world at all. And I think that's like a very solid way to write a book, especially a first book. But because it's like you don't have time to doubt yourself and you don't have time to psych yourself out. All you have time to do is wake up and sort of, you're still like a little bit in a dreamy brain and just write. And that can be really freeing. There's a reason why the morning pages are such a kind of trope in writing, in the writing world. You just get up and write. By the time I was writing my second book, I had 2 small children. Well, when I was writing the first draft, I had 1 small child, a baby. And so anyone out there who's a parent of young children, it felt very hard to get anything done. And I had to be like ruthless with my time. So I literally I had a really tiny laptop and I would stick it in the stroller and always have it with me. And, whenever the kid fell asleep, I'd be like, okay, all right, I'm going to write a paragraph. There were lots of like scribbled notes on the backs of envelopes in the kitchen, things like that. And lots of nap times got spent writing the book. And I had to do a lot of, anyone who's a parent, I think can probably relate. You have to sort of train yourself. Like, I know there's laundry there. I know there's stuff that has to get done. I'm going to not look at it. I'm just going to face the other way because that stuff will all get done eventually. But the writing I have to force into existence. And that book, I think, also really holds the imprint of that time. It's called The Mermaid of Brooklyn. It's basically like a overgrown short story. There's one main character, there's one storyline. It's like a 250-page short story. And then the third book, which is this one, I had a totally different shape of time. My kids were in school a little bit. My schedule was a little more unpredictable, and I would have these long chunks of time sometimes. So I knew that I wanted it to be a couple different strands of stories mixed together. So I divided them out and wrote, one strand of story. I'd have 2 weeks at a time where the kids were in camp or something and write that strand of the story. And then 2 weeks of time, while my mom, Peggy Sharon, she's here somewhere. Hi, Mom. Would come and watch the kids for a few weeks, or I'd go to visit my parents for a few weeks and say, okay, this is my writing time for now, and write that strand of the story. And then I had a longer chunk of time where all the strands got tied together. And I think, and this book has a lot of historical research in it, and what could have never been written if I didn't have long chunks of time. And then the next book that's about to go out on submission is I was working full time, and it was written on my lunch breaks. And so it's like these little chunks of story. It's actually written in letters, which is a perfect form if you only have 45 minutes at a time to write. But 45 minutes at a time every day is actually a really, I think, great way to construct a novel. You never get to the point where you're like, I hate what I've written. This is horrible. You don't have time. So I do think that's like a great guardrail that you can set up for yourself if you tend to get blocked or start to kind of doubt yourself. You can literally just set up your time so that you don't have time for that. If you say, all right, I have an hour to write, I don't have time to procrastinate, and I don't have time to doubt it. I don't even have time to reread it, really. I just have time to write. And it's like you can like outrun your inner critic kind of. Yeah, I have not been paying attention to time at all, Julie.
You're good. You have a couple more minutes.
Okay. And I think that you can like kind of work backwards from that and figure out what kind of writer you are, or for the next book. I also think that's true, that and it's something that people get stuck on, which is that every book you're really kind of starting from scratch, and you don't have to have like a set way that you write, which I think it's tempting to kind of love that idea. Like, here's my thing, here's how I write. It's at this time of day, I have this kind of pencil, I say a spell or whatever it is. But it doesn't, most of us don't have lives where we can afford to be that precious about things, and everything's always changing, and you can figure out a new way to write with every project. And I feel like you can do, so I'll share this little essay that I wrote. And there's like kind of a quiz in it to see how you can write your book. It's like, do you think better in the morning? Do you think better at night? Do you have an urgent story to tell, or do you just kind of feel like writing? I feel like there's all these questions you can ask yourself and sort of figure out, what kind of time do I need to write this book? Or how can I make this book exist? I feel like there's a lot of writers out there who have books they want to write or love the idea of writing a book. But it sounds really intimidating. And I think it's just like anything. It's just a series of steps, really. You just have to commit to them. Yeah. And it's very interesting to me now. Now I'm writing the next book, of course, and my time is totally different because it's pandemic time now. And I have these giant chunks of time, and the book is totally taking on a different form because of that. You can just like think in a different way when you have these sort of giant chunks of time. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if to readers of Unseen City, if it's hopefully it's not obvious that there's kind of two main story strands and then this kind of interstitial strand, and they were all written in completely different contexts, had different methods. One has a lot of research, one is contemporary. They have kind of different voices. And it was like really shaped by this method of writing these strands completely differently. And there were like 4 other strands that then didn't make their way into the book. All of which is to say I'm a really inefficient writer, but I do it a lot. So I end up with a lot of pages. Which of your books are in paperback? Do they have discussion guides? What's the name of your new book? Thank you, David Tuckman. This is in paperback. The Mermaid of Brooklyn is in paperback. My first book, do you want to hear a sad story? My first book came out, it's called How Far is the Ocean from Here? It came out in hardcover, which is actually like a lovely experience for a writer to like hold your book in hardcover, and it's like a beautiful object and all of that. But then the publishing world in a nutshell, the publishing imprint that published it folded, and it never came out in paperback. So if any of you happen to run lovely presses and feel like reissuing a nice 2008 book about a runaway surrogate mother, hit me up. Did they have discussion guides? What an interesting question. Yeah, my second book, The Mermaid of Brooklyn, has a discussion guide in it. It has like a, that was just how the publishers packaged it. And it has like a reading group guide. I did some reading group visits with it, which was really fun. I especially love visiting. I'm totally down to visit virtual book clubs, especially if you have the kind of book club where people like kind of just drink a lot of wine and then talk about the book for like 20 seconds and then just start gossiping. I love those ones. And the new book, I don't know. I think it's going to be called, right now it's called Dear Edna Sloan. It's about like a writer who disappears and then this editor who's trying to find her, and he's writing her all these letters. They'll probably change it. My titles always get changed. But yeah. Any other questions, or should we save other questions for the end?
I think let's save other questions for the end. But if you've thought of questions for Amy right now, put them in the chat, and then we'll collect them for the end. That was great. Do you have anything else you wanted to say before I move on?
I love you all. Hold on, I need to. I'm going to drop this essay in the chat.
Yeah, I definitely want to take your quiz.
I know, that's your homework. Take the quiz and then write your book and then get back to me.
Okay, yeah. So Michelle, she just put it in the chat. Mm-hmm. Awesome. I feel like I'm doing my training wheels book now because my first book was a novel and stories, and that's how I think a lot of writers start writing, by stories. Mm-hmm. So, but to write a novel, now it's my training wheels one. So we'll see. We'll see how it comes out. Okay. Anyway, Amy Shern, Unseen City. It's a great book, and you can't really see that I'm holding it up because I got the virtual. There we go. We're both holding it up. So check it out if you haven't read it yet. I have to say I loved all the historical part. I loved both the modern thread and the historical stuff. So it was a perfect book for me.
Oh, thank you. And I'll just say really quick, the historical research was like a great way to slightly procrastinate. If anybody kind of wants to write a book, but also kind of wants to slightly procrastinate it, you should include a lot of historical research.
Thanks. Okay, we are going to move on to Sarah Ansbacher, who was right here in Modiin with me. Well, not with me, but in her house in Modiin across town. Sarah was born in London. She's previously written 3 young adult novels and 1 historical novel called Far from the Place We Called Home. And those are under her maiden name, which you'll have to tell us what your maiden name is. But tonight we're going to hear about Passage from Aden, Stories from a Little Museum in Tel Aviv, which came out last month. And it's based on her experiences working at the Aden Jewish Heritage Museum in Tel Aviv, which I cannot wait to go visit when it opens up.
All right, so thank you for having me, first of all. I hope you can hear me. The story of how I came to write Passage from Aden is a story in of itself. And it starts 14 years ago when I was still living in London. And I had an idea for a novel. I started writing this novel, got about halfway through the first draft, and then a few things happened. I was pregnant with my youngest. We decided to move to Israel, and the book got left on the side, but I brought it with in my hand luggage. We came to Israel. Moving to a new country is always a challenge. But a few months after we moved here, I had a baby. And then what we didn't plan for was the financial crash. and the crash of the currency. And we were working with the UK. So we had a few very challenging years, and the book got left on the side, never forgotten. Fast forward to September 2016, and I was pretty burnt out with all of the internet stuff. And I love writing. Writing to me is like water, and I was so thirsty for it, and I missed it. And I picked up this book again, and I still loved it. And I was still as passionate about it as I had been way back. And I was speaking to a friend about it and telling her that I was picking up this book again. I'd started years before, and she asked me what it was about. And I told her that I told her the story and so forth, and happened to mention that one of the characters in it is Udemy. And she goes, "What does that mean?" I said, "You've never heard of the Udemy community?" And she goes, "No. I grew up in London, and I just assumed that everyone was familiar with the community. She was born in the States." And I realized then that I had to go right back to the beginning, and I'd left something out, that I'd never really explained where this character had come from. So to explain a little bit about the community, Aden is a port city, which today is part of Yemen. But from 1839 to 1967, it was a British colony. There's been a Jewish community living in Aden, we know, for at least 1,000 years. Back in the 11th and 12th centuries, it was a big, prominent community. But over the centuries that followed, due to war, conflict, and so forth, the community declined. And by the time the British arrived in 1839, there was just 550 people living in Aden, of which 250 of them were Jewish, 250 Muslim, and 50 from India, entire population. And then after it became a colony, people started coming in because of work opportunities, because of the port. And so too, the Jewish community began to grow, with people coming in from Yemen, from India, from Iraq, from a couple came in from Persia, all surrounding areas, Turkey as well. And that became the Udemy community. So it's a community it's a real blend, and the customs as well are a blend of Yemenite, Sephardi, Mizrahi customs all together. So it's a really unique and really special community. Today, there's no community left in Aden whatsoever. In 1947, there were riots. 87 members of the community were murdered brutally. Many people left. There was a small community that remained right up until 1967. And in 1967, just before the British left, the entire Jewish community were forced to leave. Some came to Israel, and a lot also in the 60s moved to London. So today you have a big Jewish community from Aden living both in Israel and also in London. So this is how I know the community well. So this is the story of the community. But I need to explain who this character was. How do you explain what it means to be Udemy? And that's when I discovered there was a small little museum in Tel Aviv called the Eden Jewish Heritage Museum. And I walked through the doors of the museum on the 1st of November, 2016. And if ever there was a time that walking through a door actually changed the path of my life, it was that day. I went in there and I did find the information I needed. But more than that, 6 months later, I was offered a job to work there. So the question I had gone in there to answer turns out that to be a question that when I'm working there, I answer every day. But when I was first offered the job, I was a little bit unsure. My Hebrew wasn't brilliant. It's a bit better now, still not 100% fluent, but definitely better. And I wasn't sure how I'd manage with the Hebrew. I also wasn't sure whether I'd find it an interesting job day in, day out, to be there. But I love the community. I love the museum. I thought, I'll give it a go. From the very first day, though, this place I realized was magic. that every single day there were stories. Every single day, people were coming in from the community, telling the stories of what it was like to grow up in Aden. People were coming in from the Yemenite community, the Temani community. Now, most people who came from Yemen in the 1940s came via Aden and then were airlifted between 1949 and 1951 on Operation Magic Carpet. So they too have the most fascinating stories. I heard stories from people who came from different places in the Middle East, from Algeria, from Iraq, and there's parallels with some of the stories with those different communities. But more than that, I also heard stories from tourists. So I met German tourists who weren't Jewish, who came to Israel because they were curious, all sorts of reasons. And we ended up having conversations sometimes that I never expected to have, talking about the Holocaust. I talked religion with tourists who were Christian and Muslim, and all of us coming away really enlightened, really uplifted from this exchange. And I started writing these stories down. First, just for me, because I didn't want to forget them, because some of them just blew me away. And it gave me a whole different perspective and a whole different way of looking at Jewish history, and a whole different way, really, of looking at the world. It's a time when we read so much about anti-Semitism. To meet people who were coming and who were curious and who were interested in Israel, in Judaism, in the history of a little community that they've never heard of. And I suddenly realized that what we hear in the media isn't necessarily the full story, that there's a whole other story, and there's a darkness, but there's also a light. There's also people who are positive and who want to learn for themselves, not just what they hear in the media. And so I started writing these stories initially just to remember this, just to keep hold of that for myself. And then I started sharing them with friends. And then I started sharing a few of them on social media with wider friend group on Facebook. I would write these stories when I had a few minutes spare between visitors. If I didn't have time at work, I would be hanging off a bus and holding my phone and quickly scribbling these notes so I wouldn't forget the details. And I'd be writing them when I got home, and I was just writing and writing and writing all of these stories. And friends on Facebook would start saying, you should really make a book out of these, and you should really make a book out of these. And it was an idea in the back of my mind, but it was, I've got this novel, I've got this novel, I've got this novel I want to do. But these stories were amazing too. So I just kept writing them and putting it to the side. You know, one day, someday, I'll write this book. And someday came in March 2020, when suddenly we had lockdown, and suddenly we had to close the museum. And suddenly I was floundering, and there was uncertainty. And we didn't know when we'd be able to reopen, or what would happen, or what would be. And so I began compiling all those stories, 3 years worth, thousands and thousands and thousands of words, taking them from letters, from documents, from Facebook, from all of these different places where I'd written them, putting them all together. And that book became Passage from Aden, Stories from a Little Museum in Tel Aviv. So I'm not sure how much time we've got. Are we done for time?
I can have a few more minutes, I think. It's fine.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, should I read a story quickly, or I'm not sure.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'll read one really quickly. Adonim, the 80-something said as he entered and set down 2 bundles of shopping bags. We always used to be against them. There was a twinkle in his eye, good-natured. It was clear he wasn't serious. Why is that, I asked. I'm Timony. We were in school together. There was always this rivalry. They'd say, you Timonim. We'd say, you Adonim. But why? He shrugged, amused. I don't know. We were children. He settled himself onto the bench at the entrance. He was on his way back from shopping at Shukha Carmel, and a little tired. Since it was quiet, I joined him on the bench. He discovered I came from London and switched to near flawless English, with a slight accent. Perhaps that should have come as a surprise, but it hadn't yet occurred to me. He was born to a Yemenite family in Karamat Temanim, a neighborhood in Tel Aviv, adjoining Shukakar Mill, the market. His grandparents, great-grandparents, had emigrated from Yemen in the 1880s and settled in Kfar Shiloach, a village in Jerusalem, also known as Siloam, just outside the old city walls. Back then, his father didn't speak much Hebrew. Amongst themselves, they spoke Arabic, but he was also fluent in Yiddish and Ladino to converse with the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. Life in Jerusalem in the 30s was tough, with few work opportunities. His parents were almost destitute. Right before he was born, they moved to Tel Aviv, where his father found work as a builder. They settled in Karamat Temanim, where most of the families were Yemenite. It was the poorest neighborhood in Tel Aviv. Between the low hovels, there was no paving, only sand. As a boy, there was a friendly rivalry between the Temani kids like himself and the Udni kids who lived in Mahane Yosef and Shabazi, the neighborhood close to where the museum is situated. Between their two areas lay a predominantly Arab neighborhood, which hugged the coastline and stretched across towards Yafa. It looked much like Karamat Temanim, with squat homes and sandy streets. The Arab landlord of his parents' home lived there. In those days, the children from these neighborhoods would play together in the streets. Apart from the usual childhood arguments, they all got along. The school he attended was Talmud Torah in Kalisha Street. Today, the building housed an art school. All the boys there were Temani or Udni. It was the only school we could go to. How come, I asked? There was segregation in those days. None of the Ashkenazi schools would accept us. My mouth dropped open. Of all the boys I knew during that time there, not a single one continued on to high school. Some didn't even finish up the last grade of year 8. They had to leave school and get jobs to help their family. Most took on manual work in a garage, became builders. They gave them most menial jobs, but we did what we had to do. There was a rabbi who'd recently arrived from Yemen. He needed to support his family and was forced to take a job sweeping the streets to survive. On the 29th of November 1947, after the UN vote in favour of the establishment of the State of Israel, everything changed. Arab mobs from the north to the south of the country set about attacking and murdering Jews. From the towering minaret of Hassan Bek Mosque, which still stands across the road from the David Intercontinental Hotel, Arab snipers fired indiscriminately into Karamat Temanim. They killed and injured dozens of innocent people. Fathers on their way home from work, mothers heading to the markets to shop for their family, and children on their way to school. If you were on the street and heard a bullet whistle past, you ran as fast as you could, because it meant you had a few seconds to find shelter before the sniper reloaded. The snipers often took aim at the window of their homes and his school too. I remember the loud pinging sound as the bullets hit the windows. We had regular drills in the class, practicing to dive under our desks to take cover from the shooting. He carries on to say how eventually he moved out of the neighborhood, and he eventually took a job as a builder. I asked him then suddenly where he learned to speak English so well. If he left school so early, I said, "Did you learn English in that school?" He goes, "No, not in that school." Then, in his unassuming manner, he said, "I learned it when I moved to university in England to do my PhD." What? I couldn't believe what I'd just heard. How did you manage that? My boss was very unkind, especially to my father, who was older than him and doing hard manual work, but he didn't treat him with respect. After 2 years, I left, and I swore I'd never work for an Ashkenazi boss again as a manual worker. He was just 15 when he set up on his own, renovating homes. At the same time, he decided he wanted to return to studying and pass his Buggerut, his high school exam. I went to evening college to study for my exams. I was the only one in my class who was a builder, he said. For 2 weeks of every month, I spent every day studying in the library. The other 2 weeks, I worked as a builder to pay my way through college and help support my parents. He passed his Buggerut at 18, and after completing his mandatory army service, where he was promoted to the rank of officer, he studied for a law degree. Then I moved to England for a few years to complete my PhD in law. While there, I met my wife, and we returned to live in Israel. Having finished his story, he rose from the bench, gathered his bags, where we wished each other a Shabbat Shalom, I watched him leave, filled with admiration for all that he'd achieved against all odds.
Yay, thank you. I have to say, I didn't know anything about the Edeni community before I met you, Sarah, either. I didn't really, growing up in the States, we didn't have this
Sure.
community. I didn't know there was any difference in the Yemenite, I just figured Yemenite Jews. I had no idea. So this is really, the book is delightful. I loved all the
you.
stories and your experiences as you're finding your way in Tel Aviv and in this job, and it's a great book. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
And now we're going to go to David. If you have questions for Sarah, put them in the chat and we will get to them after. So David is a first-year student at Yale School. Sorry, I didn't say your last name. David Hopen is a first-year student at Yale Law School. He's raised in Hollywood, Florida, and he earned his master's from the University of Oxford, and he graduated from Yale College. And The Orchard is his debut novel, which I read over Shabbat. And it's great. So David, take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Julie, for inviting me and for organizing this event. One of the really cool aspects of doing these events is having to have the opportunity to meet and hear from other authors. So it's been really cool to meet Julie and to hear from Amy and Sarah. Thrilled to be amongst such great company. Of course, I was prepared to do the speech in Hebrew, but given that everyone else did it in English, I will spare you my broken Hebrew. My plan is just to give a quick introduction into what the book is like, and then I can speak a bit about the process of writing it and give you just a quick glimpse into a short selection of a reading. My book is called The Orchard. Came out from HarperCollins in November, just as my first semester law school examinations were beginning. The title of my book is taken from an anecdote in the Talmud called Pardes, in which 4 rabbis enter into what is mysteriously dubbed an orchard and come face to face with God. Each rabbi leaves irreversibly changed. One rabbi is unable to withstand divinity and goes insane. One gives up his religion, another perishes, and only one leaves relatively intact. And so that was a myth that had always bewildered me. I think it's eerie, it's haunting, and I think it's also important, not only for thinking about Judaism and how one might approach forming a religious identity, but I think it's important when people think about some of the larger questions involved in forming a civic identity, a political identity. For instance, what does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be worthy, especially in a modern sense? To what degree are religiosity and ethical behavior converging or fracturing in different types of settings? So this was some meta myth that I was always interested in. I grew up attending yeshiva high schools and yeshiva day schools before that. And so having that kind of education, you normally take for granted these really fantastic, almost life-changing collection of stories. You absorb them via osmosis and then you don't think much about them. But this was one that stuck out to me, had been in my head, reverberating for a while. And so I was interested in repossessing it. So I took that myth and I transposed it into contemporary terms in my novel, which follows the story of Ari Eden, who is an 18-year-old student on the verge of his senior year of high school. He grows up in an ultra-Orthodox community in Brooklyn, New York. And abruptly, he finds himself uprooted and relocating to a suburb in South Florida. This is the appropriate setting in the background for that, where he falls into a group of magnetic, ambitious, defiant friends who begin conducting these very unconventional and increasingly dangerous moral experiments. These are students, the likes of whom Ari has never seen before. They are larger than life, and Ari finds himself drawn into this band of friends and experiencing what it is to come of age in a modern setting, and also what it is to consciously try to recreate something like accessing divinity in a modern time. I think that given what the original landmark myth of the Talmud is looking to discover, there are certain natural questions that arise from reading this kind of book. And I think these questions are rendered particularly more acute nowadays. One of the weird things about publishing during COVID, I mean, this is my debut book. I didn't know what to expect in general when I'm publishing. When there's a global pandemic, that's another twist. Being in law school is another twist. And so, but one of the bright spots about publishing a book during this time, if you can call it a bright spot, is that people are, in my opinion, even more attuned to thinking about what it is to find and uncover meaning in their life. I think people have been forced to adapt, and people have been forced to re-examine and grapple with ways to inject renewed purpose in their daily routine. People are experiencing rather grim consequences across certainly the American landscape and on the global level. And so people are, it's been my experience that readers are even more willing to look at these type of universal questions and think about what it is to find something you believe in, what it is when you rely on divinity or religion or some kind of superstructure. But even more so, I think that everyone remembers, no matter who they are, where they are in life, and what kind of background they come from. Everybody remembers what it is to come of age. Everyone remembers what it is to be on the precipice of adulthood in your late teens or even in your 20s. Things have a funny way of assuming outsized importance and grandeur and majesty. These are the times when often you are falling in love with people or ideas that haunt you or break or pierce your heart in a way that remains with you for decades and decades. And so The Orchard is both a book of ideas looking to think about some of the bigger topics in life, but it's also a book about coming of age, growing into adulthood. It's what I like to term a moral thriller. What does it mean to feel like you want to belong? What does it mean to have the paradox of juggling a modern sensibility with religious tradition? What does it mean to be fractured in this kind of world and have a desire to find a more integrated personality? And so The Orchard deals with all these topics. In some ways, because I started writing the book when I was a senior in high school myself. I was 17 or 18 years old. As I said, growing up in modern Orthodox communities, I had this funny feeling at that age, even, that this was an extraordinarily unique subculture within America that people might not have realized. While you're in it, it's somewhat of a bubble. It's a wonderful community, but it is somewhat of a bubble. And it's not until you go out and peer back in the world, oftentimes, when you realize that this is kind of unprecedented to have a community in which people are this engaged with contemporary lifestyle, with secular ambitions, with getting into the right schools, with having the right relationships, with pursuing the right careers, with every little aspect of technology or whatever might be forming modern culture. But at the same time, going to synagogue in the morning and praying and experiencing daily ritual and a dual curriculum in a school in which you spend the first half of the day engaged in Talmud and then run off to AP European history and then go off to basketball practice at the end of the day. This is a unique community that, in my opinion, hadn't really been covered, not only within contemporary American fiction, but even Jewish fiction. Nowadays, you see things like Unorthodox on Netflix or such, or tales about leaving the fold, that kind of genre. But this was not a book that falls into those things. And I wanted it to be a book that can ground a reader in a particular community that has a very wonderful and unique substance, but also it's a kind of community that takes seriously questions about God and faith. And I wanted readers to have that grounding so that I can catapult them into certain larger questions that are integral to the moral territory I was interested in exploring. So I started working on this when I was at the end of my teenage years. I started outlining the prehistoric notes when I was in high school. I went off to do a gap year in Israel, actually, before I went off to college. And so I was working on my notes then. I started writing some early scenes. This feels like a reunion with me in Israel. I haven't been there in about 8 years.
What was your gap year? Gotta say.
My gap year was in yeshiva in Beit Shemesh. And so it's nice to be back in Israel, albeit in pixelated form at the moment, but maybe another time in the flesh. But basically, I was writing this on the side. It was largely a passion project. My first 2 years of Yale College, I was finding moments to write when I could piece them together. I was in the midst of coursework and extracurricular life and other obligations. And when I had time, I would write. When the muse descended on me late at night, I would write. On weekends, sometimes if I had a moment, I would write. But it was mostly a passion project. It was something I was excited about and loved doing, but it wasn't something that was formally part of my coursework. I wasn't in a program designed to do that. I wasn't studying creative writing exclusively. But my junior year, I had the once-in-a-lifetime privilege of doing a one-on-one tutorial with the great National Book Award winner, Susan Choi, who was on faculty. And I remember, so Susan, who is obviously a brilliant writer and an even more gracious mentor, was doing, there was an opportunity to do a one-on-one with her. And I remember presenting very meekly my first 100, 150 pages or so. And Susan took me on. It was an incredible privilege, and it was also a chance to give more momentum to my writing. Susan made me feel emboldened and encouraged, and as if this were something I should pursue at the next level. And it also gave me structure to be writing. I was churning out X number of pages every week. And so that experience made me decide that I wanted to finish a draft by the time I completed my collegiate experience. Thankfully, I did. I went off to England to do a master's, and yet again found myself having to juggle my schoolwork and then my mistress on the side, my novel. I was working on my dissertation, and when I had free moments, going back to my my book, revising it at that point, ready to send it off. And so now that I'm back in school, it feels like an appropriate full circle moment to have launched the book on the same night that I had a very large paper due and a 3-hour seminar to go to. And people were texting me and saying, I hope you're having a drink and celebrating now. And I said, well, actually I'm in class for the next 3 hours and then I have something due at midnight. But I've been very grateful for these opportunities. I've loved the experience of being in an educational setting while doing this, and in parts because I think the book takes place in a high school, and there's something about educational institutions that both have their own way of building a certain mythology. Things are self-contained. The world seems like it is enveloped in whatever structure the school is offering and the kind of social capital the school is offering. And at the same time, I think that my book self-consciously tries to unite different worlds I've been in. So having grown up and continuing to practice modern orthodoxy, but experiencing the world and going to different countries and studying new cultures and new ideas and wonderful academic settings, I've seen what it is to dance in different worlds and to attempt to render each one deeper. I think that the animating philosophy of modern Orthodox Judaism, particularly in America, is this idea of Torah Umada, the notion that culture and religion ought to heighten each other and enhance each other and not prove in conflict, at least always. And so my hope is that readers of The Orchard, whether they are Jewish or not, whether they are of a certain age or not, think about what it is to have that thrill of dancing in different worlds, the way my main character finds himself transposed in a new world and is trying to piece together certain things and reforming identity. One of the wonderful experiences of having the book out in the world after writing it intensely and privately for so long is that you surrender some ownership of the book. And so I've enjoyed seeing readers all across the spectrum reach out to me and tell me that the characters are people who have a way of finding permanent real estate in their head weeks later after reading the book, or having this experience of going back and thinking about what it was like when they were coming of age and when they were in this experience, or people have the joy of learning about new cultures. So it's a book that, although it begins in a particular nuanced subtext, it very much is a book grappling with universal themes. And so it's been a great joy to see readers experience that for themselves. And parts of the thriller aspects of the book leave some questions and ambiguities, and I've enjoyed seeing readers formulate their own opinions on that. So I will now just close by giving 2 quick readings. I will read from the prologue and just a few pages that come after, just to give a quick taste of the atmosphere of the book. So this is the prologue presented without commentary. Is tragedy dead? This is what I asked Mrs. Hartman at the end of it all, when I was still obsessed with every fatal flaw but my own. She didn't ask why I needed to know. Instead, she asked me to define tragedy for her. I told her this was impossible. Tragedy was a sub-philosophy, something to be felt, not defined. She shook her head. Majestic sadness, she told me. That's tragedy. I thought about that night, standing side by side with Evan and Amir in those waning moments before the policemen, the fire trucks, the body count. I thought about the look on Evan's suit-washed face. I wonder if Noah is seeing this, he had said, his voice soft, sad. After everything that had happened our senior year, it was the way he said this that made me cry. If that was not majestic sadness, I decided, nothing was. Well, Mr. Eden, she blinked at me. Did it die with the Greeks? No, I said, I suppose not. And this second selection comes very shortly after, when Ari learns that his family will be moving to South Florida, to this new and dazzling alien world. And Ari has this moment where he is packing up his things and having a moment of introspection before he departs from Brooklyn. My last months in Brooklyn dissolved at a terrific pace. There was a flurry of packing, everything we owned, quite little, stuffed into boxes and trucks. There were solitary walks through my neighborhood. There were things I left behind, torn basketball sneakers I'd worn to death, forgotten birthday letters, discolored Parsha cards I'd won in school raffles. At the end of my days in Brooklyn, I stood in my bare bedroom, staring at my mirror, watching 17 years fade. The furniture gone, the rooms emptied, everything whitewashed. A general sense of melancholy hit me for the first time since my parents announced the move. Leaving didn't make me sad. On the contrary, the exhilarating prospect of trading my dreary, uneventful life for something new was at long last within reach. What was saddening was the realization that in time, we stand in emptied houses to learn we've never made a mark. So I think those 2 little passages are sufficient to give you a little taste of the flavor and ambition of this book. One of the consequences of being in Zoom School of Law so often is that when my professors are lecturing, you have to be on call that you're going to get cold called. And so I don't monitor the chat as much. And now I did the same thing now. So if I missed anything in the chat, I guess just let me know. And I'll turn this back over. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, David. That was great. Yeah, there's lots of questions in the chat, and let me just go up and get them. And I think, hang on a second, I have to unmute Sarah and Amy as well, because 1 second. Okay, so first of all, there's a lot of praise for all 3 of your books, okay, in the chat. People who read Amy's book, or Sarah's book, or David's book, everybody's saying how much they loved all of these books. Let's see. Getting to the question. From Dahlia, do all of you have literary agents, and how long a time did it take you to find one and get people interested in your work? So David, why don't you start and then we'll go around.
Yeah, I do have a literary agent, the wonderful Emily Forland. I love working with Emily, and I feel very grateful to be working with her. I found an agent. I guess the best advice I can give someone is that you should draw up a list of writers who you admire and see who's representing their works, and especially if these are the works that are similar to the kind of thing you're producing. I connected with Emily really, I believe, when I just finished my first draft of the book and I was studying in England. And it was sort of a natural process from there.
Anyone else want to jump in, Sarah or Amy?
Amy, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. That's how I'm on my second agent now, but that's how I found my first agent. This was 100 years ago. David was a baby and there wasn't social media, and like I couldn't, so it's kind of harder to tell like who represented who. And I remember like standing in a bookstore and like opening books that I thought, exactly what David was saying, that I thought seemed like books that I loved and writers who I kind of felt like were in the same world as what I was trying to do, and looking at their acknowledgements, and you know, because everyone thinks their agent and their acknowledgements, and I'm keeping a list. And I my first agent was actually the first agent I contacted, but I was sort of like, hey, you represent blah, 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 blah. You might like me. And then my second, and then we have sort of like gone, you know, it's better for both of us. We've kind of gone separate ways. But my current agent I met in like the most Brooklyn way ever, which was at a children's birthday party. And we were, you know, kind of like waiting for our kids to do something and talking and being like, what do you do? Oh yeah, really? And then we started talking about the kind of books we love, and we were like, oh my God. Wait, is this a match? And her name is Julie Stevenson. She's at Massey McQuilkin, and she is incredible. She's like the most, this book, it took a long time to find a publisher for it. It's a strange book. It's like a cross-genre book. And she was like my cheerleader the whole time. Like I had never had that experience with any of my agents or editors before, where like we would get a drink in the before times in the same place, and she'd just be like, everything's okay and your book is great and you're great. She's like a therapist too. She's really like a dream agent. So yeah, yay, Julie Stevenson. So talk to people at children's birthday parties. That's my advice.
Great. Sarah?
So me, no. This book I independently published. It was actually an experiment at the beginning to see what would happen. It was locked down and I went for it, and the response has been amazing. So yeah, that's where I am with this one.
Okay, so there's been a lot of question about where people can buy books. For those of us in Israel, Book Depository has, I think, all three of the books. Although I saw Carol said you don't buy from Amazon. Unfortunately, I have to say that Book Depository is owned by Amazon. So yeah, it's kind of a bummer. I don't know if Bookshop delivers here. I haven't seen that they do, but if somebody wants to correct me, then please, I'd rather support Bookshop. Avi, thank you for putting the link to my book in the chat. And Sarah, you still have books available for people in Modiin that want to?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So for Israel and Modiin,
yeah,
they're welcome to contact me, and I can send something to them.
Okay. Okay. There were some questions for David about, let me just scroll back up. David, I absolutely loved your book. This is from Nama, and she wrote you an amazing review on Goodreads, I have to say. I saw it today. It's very long. So check out Nama's review on Goodreads. It didn't seem biographical, but did seem deeply personal and authentic. How does it feel to write something so seemingly personal?
Thank you, Nama, for the question and for the review. A variation of this question is usually everyone's favorite thing to ask at these events. Was this a biographical story? It is not, rest assured. What I did draw from, of course, was what it is to grow up in a particular community that offers what is basically a dual curriculum, where you are going to pray and going to Talmud class and having a very serious relationship with tradition, while at the same time simultaneously experiencing a very normal approach to contemporary high school life and just generally contemporary life. I think one of the great features of modern Orthodox Judaism is that finding a very deeply enriching connection to the world does not come at the expense of having to sacrifice um, civic engagement or rigorous um, secular ambitions. I think that the two absolutely can coexist, and that is, to a large degree, something explored in this book. I think it's been interesting and thrilling to see people ask these questions, particularly when they want to know if this is an autobiographical work. I think it's a fun and natural impulse to associate. But you can, people can know that the book is, the explosive pyrotechnical aspects of the book are very much fictionalized, but the experience of growing up and grappling with these questions about faith and religion and the interplay of the two with the modern world, those are real questions, and I think they're very apt and worth considering no matter what kind of background you come from.
I was gonna say, I was gonna ask you also myself. I'm like, wow. I mean, I didn't go to yeshiva high school, but like, they got into some pretty wild stuff there, and I was like, whoa, okay. So I'm interested to hear that you say some of that was fictionalized. So
very much fictionalized, and I will say also that, I mean, a lot of the major events in the book are, they both have philosophical undertones, and so this is what it would look like if you take seriously certain pillars of a belief and stretch it to an extreme, and also they're plot devices to get characters from A to B to C. And so I think those are important things to keep in mind as you read.
Okay. The only other question I saw in the chat was about if the books are available in England, which I think they are on Amazon UK. I think all three of them are. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I have a question for David. It's a general question. It's a mystery that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I'm wondering if you can solve it for me.
Yeah.
So how come I feel like there's so much crossover between novelists and lawyers? And I feel like I know so many lawyers who are like, well, I wanted to be a writer, but I went to law school. And I'm like, I don't get how how that was even like the next option. Like, I don't understand how they're connected. And several people I went to my MFA with then went on to law school. Can you explain the connection? What's the connection? How are they related at all?
Great question. This is the timeless
for
question.
Everyone in the legal profession right now on the record. Thank you.
I will represent all of my colleagues in this, but no, I mean, I think people, when they heard I was going to law school, writers oftentimes know that they either have come from law school or might go to law school, and every lawyer wants to go publish their book. But people, I think, understood that this was sort of the natural confluence of my interests and also the logical next step in my career. I'd always intended to go to law school. I enjoy this idea of integrating literary and legal. I think there's a lot of overlap, ranging
How
from.
Is there a lot of overlap? Is it really?
Well, so let me say, I think the overlap is that if you're somebody who really thinks that there is a moral impact of language and that words matter and not just on the page. I mean, it's one thing to write something for entertainment. It's another thing when it has a life outside of the page and go on to do something in the world. And that's what I've very much enjoyed about law school so far. When you're writing something, when you're interpreting a text, it's not always just an intellectual exercise. There's a human being at the other end of that page.
That also
so I think it helps to approach law humanistically like that. And Amy's doing the dance, and I think she might agree. So,
I got it.
I mean, that for me, that's been exciting for me. I mean, other lawyers or writers might feel differently, but
I get it. Thank you.
I've allowed participants to unmute themselves. If anybody wants to hop in and ask a question live and not just in the chat, you can all do that now.
Wait, sorry,
yeah,
can I ask
keep
a
going.
Sarah question?
Yeah.
Sarah, you said are you still working on the novel or a
Yeah,
novel?
the novel's basically finished, doing final read through, final edit. So hopefully by the spring it's done.
We were debating, should she come
Incredible.
on now or after the novel? So I don't know. We decided now, and now everybody knows about both of Sarah's books. So you'll come again.
Okay, we can pre-order the novel.
Yeah. If you have a pre-order link, Sarah, put that
Not
in.
yet, not yet.
Okay.
Still working on it.
Okay.
But I'll keep you posted.
That's very exciting.
Great. Okay. So you're working, so you just sent off your next book to your agent, Amy. You said Sarah's book is coming out. David, are you working on anything new now, or are you
You're just going
I'm
along.
I'm
in
at
your
work
spare
on
time?
I'm at work on a second novel. There's some other exciting opportunities with The Orchard, adaptation wise, and also my next semester of school starts in a few days, and I'm working on getting a little more sleep. So all of those things together.
Adaptation wise, that sounds intriguing.
I have a
Yeah.
question for Amy. So are you working on anything new now that your novel has gone to the agent? Are you working on something else in the meantime?
Yeah. So it's always very confusing because there's always that kind of overlap. And I don't know if you're the same way. I always feel like the thing I'm very excited about that I really want to talk about is the thing that I'm writing that nobody has read and that I also don't want to talk about because I'm
Yeah.
stuck.
Yeah.
It's like, like the next thing always feels like, oh, this is the best thing I've ever written, because it's not done yet. I haven't like ruined it yet. So I'm like, it's perfect. It's all in my head. It's, right now I feel like it's the best thing ever. And then that's when I know I'm done with the draft, is when I start to move over into feeling like this is horrible. I hate this. That's when I know it's time to send it to my agent and she can like help me get back on track. I might be like a nightmare client now that I'm saying that out loud.
How many drafts do you write before you send it to your agent, would you say?
It really is different with every book. But so this is advice that I would give to no one. I don't think this is really how you're supposed to do this. But I tend to, like this book that I just sent to her that she's sending out tomorrow. I went through a bunch of drafts myself. This book was like a really quick book. It's funny because this book took probably 5 or 6 years to write, and the next book just was like, well, here it is. It was written very quickly, and I went through a couple drafts and then just sent it to her. I don't even have beta readers, which I don't really recommend that, but I think I just in my MFA program, I got very maxed out on like the group workshop and ended up feeling like, because I will take everyone's advice and I see everybody's point of view. So, you can really workshop something into oblivion. So to me, it's worked better to have one person who I really, really trust. So I gave her a draft last year and then she gave me some notes back and then I gave it back to her. But yeah, but so then I'm working on something new now though, which is I have like 100 pages of it, and it. I mean, I don't know. I think maybe to a reader, there's something. I think that my books all have some voice and some sensibilities in common, but to me, it feels like something totally different. And I'm trying to just write in a really raw way, which is hard when you I feel like it's easier to write that way for your first book because you sort of think, well, at least I sort of thought probably no one's ever going to read this. So you're able to write in this way, in this sort of like high wire act way. And then I think you start to get a little more self-conscious, like with David, the first time you go through the round of questions where everyone's like, so how much of this is you? And you start feeling like, oh my God, I don't want to talk about this with everyone. It's like harder to separate out your writer self and your real life self and to like be as free as you want to be as your writer self. So I'm trying to get back to that place now of just writing in like a very raw way. And I have to pretend nobody's going to read it in order to make something good that people will want to read. that's not useful advice. Nobody should do that. It's
I
wrong.
think there's
but-
something to be said about writing in a raw way, though. When I want to do that, I write by hand, like just the book I'm working on now. I wrote the whole first draft by hand. I had no idea how many pages and words I had, and then I had to transcribe it. But I felt like if I tried to do it on the computer, I would have just revised the first paragraph like 1,000 times and not gotten anywhere. So just there's something about the act of writing by hand. And even now when I'm stuck somewhere at a point, whether with the novel or on a short story, I'm just like, let me just take out my notebook and go sit somewhere and try to write. And because whatever, you're not going to go back and start crossing off you're just going to let it flow. So that's one tip.
Yeah, I think that's a really good tip. There's this Zadie Smith has this great essay about writing that of course I can't remember what it's called. It's something to do with micromanagers. Anyway, she talks about like what kind of writer are you? And she says, I'm a micromanager, which means I will write the first paragraph and then edit it over and over and over again until it's perfect and then move on. And she's sort of like, that's totally the wrong way to write. Don't write that way. But but I think it's kind of can be a form of procrastination too, and like self-preservation. But I think, so if you want to break out of that, getting off the computer, I think is good. And I just saw there's some questions. Beta readers are like the first person who reads your draft. I did that with my first couple books. And I was like, okay, got it. And my MFA program I went to the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. It's a great program. It's 3 years long and they fully fund everyone who goes. That was mostly how I was like 3 years of writer camp and don't have to pay for it. This is great. It was a very like pure 3 years of, they really focus on just reading and writing. And it's one of those MFA programs where they don't do a lot of like networking or talking about the business, which I was sort of annoyed at the time, but actually I think it's great. I'm such a better writer because of it. I think those are
As a kif, as we say here in Israel, is a kif. Like that sounds like so much fun. Just for 3 years.
Oh, I want to do it again.
I actually heard you on a podcast, Amy, with Brad Listy. You were talking your MFA program there. You were saying something about how everybody else was like, their parents were lamenting their decision to get an MFA, but your parents were very supportive of it. So
yeah, my parents were here. Hi guys. They're like, that's great. They're so encouraging. Yeah, everyone else was like, aren't your parents mad that you're not at law school like David Hopin? And I was like, no, they don't. I mean, also like my parents know me, and they're like, this, if you're gonna do anything, it's probably this.
Were you always intending to do an MFA?
I always wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to be a writer from when I was like 5, and it was really my only idea. I was like, I hope this works. Got nothing else.
It did.
So far, so good.
Wait, there is a question back here for David. Was it important for you to write an impactful novel, or is that just where the story took you?
Interesting question. I think to some degree, everybody wants to write an impactful novel. I think seeing readers find bits of themselves in characters and being unable to put a book down even when they want to sometimes is in many ways the point of writing certain types of books. So yes, in other aspects, this is where the story took me. The consequences in this story, for good and for bad, are the results of the journeys the characters choose to pursue. And so sometimes even when I wanted to look away, I wasn't able to. And I'll also say that I guess I'll defer to the great Philip Roth, who would say that fiction is not a moral beauty contest. And I am not one to contest anything Mr. Roth says, but I would say that it doesn't have to be a moral beauty contest. There doesn't have to be a pageant going on, but I do think there is a certain moral utility to fiction, particularly to novels. And I did want to tap into that kind of energy and ambition, because in my academic work, I enjoy writing things that have to deal with legal and moral and political philosophy, which is to say the big questions in life. But there's something about putting it into the form of a novel, and something about seeing characters experience things that we've all thought about and that we've all experienced to some degree. And I think seeing that play out on the page in a very human way makes it more accessible and makes it more impactful. So that's kind of how I conceptualized it when I approached it.
Great. Okay, there is a question for all of you guys. Do you all find you echo the style of authors you read? Who wants to go first? Anyone?
I'll say that I don't think that I do. I think that but I think I used to. I think I'm more in control of my voice as a writer now, and that's not a concern to me. But I feel like I know. I feel like that's a big concern with students. Whenever I'm teaching writing people, there's always the person who's like, well, should I not read fiction while I'm writing, because then I'll sort of soak in that person's voice. And I actually think that, especially when you're starting out as a fiction writer, that's actually a really good exercise. I took this great class in my MFA program that was a style workshop, and it was so much fun. All we did was read different stylists, really writers who are really known for their style. Like, we're reading Faulkner and Joyce and everyone, and then we rewrote the same passage every week. It was like a 2-page story, and we'd rewrite it every week in the style of whoever we were studying. And it was such a great exercise, because you really get to know. I mean, style is like one of the tools in your toolbox, like anything else, and you can completely control it the way you can your dialogue or your setting. But when you're starting off as a writer, it feels hard to control. So I feel like an exercise like that is actually great. But I don't think that that happens to me now. And I know that there are writers who say that they don't read well, but I will couch that by saying sometimes I'll stay away from books that seem too similar to what I'm trying to do. Like when I was writing Unseen City, it's a ghost story, and I actually tried to stay away from ghost stories while I was writing the first draft, just because I wanted to make sure that I was doing my own thing and not getting wrapped up in like, well, that's not how a ghost story really works. So just to sort of give myself that freedom, I stayed away from it. But yeah, but I read a lot, and I'm always writing. So I'm always reading while I'm writing. And yeah, it's not something that I worry about, I don't think. Is that an answer? I don't know.
Yeah.
What about you guys?
I don't think so, no. If I could write as well as some of the authors I most admire, that would be amazing. I didn't want to write exactly like them, but to write to that level, like Zadie Smith, for example, or Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. If I could write on that level, wow. So yeah, but I think stories are always so different, and even every story you write, every book you write, your style changes according to the story, I feel, to an extent.
Yeah.
So I think you find your own voice through the story rather than anyone else's. What about you, Julie?
Do I echo? No, I don't think I echo. I mean, I model a little bit. Like my book, very much, I was trying to model Olive Kitteridge, not in the way, only because like it was a book of linked stories, and I wanted also to write a book of linked stories. And also I like to think of my characters, like if Olive Kitteridge was reincarnated as like a elderly Jewish male version of Olive Kitteridge, then maybe, then that could be Jeremiah. But I don't think I necessarily write in the same style as her, but like I did a whole analysis of Olive Kitteridge when I was working on it, and like how many stories were written from Olive's point of view and how many from other people's point of view. And actually a highlight of my life was last year when I was in Connecticut, and sorry about the light on my face. Elizabeth Strout was speaking at the Westport Public Library, which is like 2 towns away from where my parents live, and I went to hear her speak, and I stood in line and I got my her to sign my copy of Olive Again, and I gave her a copy of my book, which was just amazing. Anyway, so I don't think I model anybody necessarily, but yeah. David, what about you?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I consciously do. I think every writer undergoes what my former professor would term an anxiety of influence. You read, especially when you read widely, you have a habit of admiring certain writers, and those are the writers that echo in your head. But I don't think it's something I do intentionally. I don't think it's even the most productive thing to do, because I think part of getting your training wheels, as we've discussed, is getting your running start and finding your own voice. And so when you are ever mentioned in the same sense as some of the, some of your idols, it's an incredible feeling, but it's, you both realize that there's, an enormous gulf between those kind of writers and all, in your own work. And I think it's important when you find your own habits, your own voice. And it's cool when people will reach out and say, this is something, that sounds like you. And I think it's important to try to get to that point in your writing, even if it's by accident.
I have a question for you guys. Do you find that it's easier writing characters that are very much like, that are definitely not you? Or are you, like, that's my struggle right now. It's like in my first book, the main character is male, and so it was easier. I don't know, somehow for me, it was easier to tap into his voice than my current book, which is the main character is like a woman around my age, and whatever, I'm just struggling with it. So maybe it's just easier for me to write about somebody who's definitely not me. So I'm wondering about you guys, what your experience is with that.
Yeah, I think when you're writing about someone who is so clearly removed from your own life, you do miss out on certain nuanced conversational cues, any little thing you can draw from in dialogue that makes it easier to write. But on the other hand, like we said earlier, you get to consciously crawl out of your own head. You don't have to worry that people are tethering a character to you or wondering if this is something you would say. And it gives you wide space to run amok on the page and do your own thing. So I have found that sometimes although it's initially harder to get a sense of how that character would sound and what that character would think about, it's a little bit liberating because there are no rules and you get to basically remold yourself.
Yeah, I feel like that's that's what's fun about writing fiction, is that you get to live a different life and imagine what it would be like to be someone else. And I've come to feel like there's actually very little difference in my characters who kind of look like me from the outside and the characters who totally don't. I think that with all of them, it's equally an act of creation. Because none of them is ever exactly me. So it's always a question of this sort of extreme empathy of trying to imagine what it would be like to be someone else, which it's like the same amount of work, I feel like, really, whether that person is kind of like me, but a little different, or completely unlike me. It's still just an act of extreme imagination and empathy either way. And similarly, there's things that about being a human in the world that help you relate to any character, so even if you don't know the sort of little t truth of somebody's everyday life as, you know, whatever. Your character is a pastry chef and you're not a pastry chef. You're like, all right, do I really know what that's like? No, but I can do the research and fill in the little t truth of that because I know the big T truth of what it means to be a person in the world, which means that you can write any character really.
I think as well it's research. For the novel that'll be coming out in the spring, I did so much research. I lived my characters. I walked the streets they walked. I cooked the foods they cooked. I would replay the scenes over in my head. As they're talking, I would sometimes walk and I would put like a film soundtrack on and I would watch those characters and I would literally watch the whole scene playing out as if it's real before I write it. So to see it from a lot of different angles. So when it goes on the page, it's real. These characters live. So I think there's loads of different ways to bring those characters to life, whether they have similarities to you or whether they don't, but to get into their lives, what they're interested in. Those characters, I think, always need to be a lot more alive and have a lot more background to them than you ever put on the page. So you need to know the things they like, even if you never mention them. But yeah, that character would like this song, or would like this person, or would like this, or would like this, or dreams of doing this. Even if you don't necessarily put all that onto the page, but to make them into real people who really live, they breathe, they have dreams, they have negative sides, they have positive sides. They're not all good or they're not all bad. They have reasons for the things that they do. And I think it's trying to work out their whole story, which may be a lot bigger than you ever see, but you need to know it. You need to know what happened to them before, and also sometimes what happens to them afterwards when the story ends, but what really happens later.
There is another question. First of all, thank you, everybody who's still on the line, and thanks to all our authors. This is great. I love having this discussion afterwards. So, okay, Abigail asked, do you miss your characters when you have finished the book? Do you miss them and think of them?
That's such a sweet question. Some of them, don't tell them. Some of them I like more than others. My second book, The Mermaid of Brooklyn, my main character was this like sort of very anxious woman who's dealing with some depression, and she's like a very intense character, and I was so sick of living in her head by the time I was done with that book. I was like, note to self, maybe don't write anxious, depressed characters because then you have to live with them for years and years and years. Love her, but it was a lot to spend so much time with her. So sometimes very not. In this book, there's a character who, so one of the main characters is this woman, Meg. She's a librarian, and this patron starts coming to the library needing help with a haunted house, to research a haunted house, and she develops this crush on him, this like extremely intense crush on him. And in writing her crush on him, I also developed a crush on him, and so I do miss because I love him. And well, no spoilers, but yeah, I think he's taken now. Anyway. But
Good guy. Yeah, I could see.
so great. I did such a good job. He's perfect. Anyway, what about David and Sarah?
I wouldn't say any crushes necessarily, but I do think it's hard to say goodbye, especially, I mean, I've only written one book, completed one book, and it's a book that I like to joke, I came of age with it. I grew up with it. It's kind of my baby. And having written it in the way I did as the end of my high school career, as a college student, these are characters I fell in love with and thought about all the time. And I had a very accurate, intimate sense of how they envisioned their life and how they saw the world and the kind of jokes they would make and little lines they would crack. So surrendering all that is a little bit difficult, although there are times when I think writing is just tiring in general and you can benefit immeasurably from giving yourself a little bit of space. But it does make it easier when you start a new project to wave goodbye to your old ones. And it particularly is easier to say goodbye to your characters when you are being slammed with school, law school work. Doesn't leave a lot of time for, weeping over your characters that you miss. So there's a natural way to say goodbye, and then law school can kind of give you that extra kick to move you forward.
That's a great tip for writers, David. Thank you.
Just enroll in law school if you want.
Yeah. So what you got to do is go to law school after your book. It's very practical. Thank you.
So I think for me, writing this book, they're all real people. So there wasn't that feeling of loss, because I thought, you know what, hopefully I'll get to meet some of them again, or hopefully when we can reopen the museum, there'll be many more stories, many more adventures. But the novel, when I finished the first draft, I burst into tears. It was really like, I felt like this pulling, but I've since rewritten it and gone back and drafts. So I get to start all over with them again. But now I'm coming to, I think, the very final to read through and edit. So yeah, I think I will miss them. They have become like, not best friends, but kind of, so much has happened because of that book. It took me to a job. It took me to this book. It's taken me to a whole lot of different places. There was definitely a certain attachment. But saying that, it's soon time to let it go out to the world and move on and write something else, I think, and get excited about a whole lot of new characters and a new adventure.
That sounded very healthy, Sarah. It was really good. I'm just gonna let them go.
Definitely.
Okay, I don't think there's any more questions unless anyone else wants to pop up and pop in, or anybody else. Okay, so this was recorded. So if you hopped in at the end, or you got kicked out for some reason and came back in, the whole thing will be up on YouTube and live on Literary Modiin and Facebook. So stay tuned. And if you registered through my website, there'll be a follow-up email tomorrow with the links to the recordings. And oh, wait. There's another question that just came in. Hold on for Amy. Can you see it in the chat?
Oh my God, Luna, this is like a giant question. You're not sorry. Okay, Luna wrote, super fascinating, Unseen City, how you openly write about Meg's discomforts as a person of privilege when trying to be sensitive to gentrification, etc. Did you spend a lot of time working out this part of her character? Yes, so much. And I was so worried about getting it right and dealing with it in a sensitive way. I did a lot of research. Actually, that part I did kind of have some beta readers sometimes. I had a couple like kind of sensitivity readers, because there's a lot about race and Meg is like a white character trying to manage how to be a good white person, basically. And she's sort of a secular Jew who is like extremely uncomfortable around the Hasidic Jewish populations in Brooklyn. And so I had a friend who's a Hasidic Jew like read those sections. So I was like, I do not want to offend anyone, but wanted to deal with that sort of feeling of being like, I'm not Jewish enough for these people. Like I can't hang. And yeah, so I tried to be really sensitive about that, and also just really honest. And also just tell myself that she's just a character dealing with these things in her own way. It's not like a statement I'm trying to make about, race in America and religion in America or anything. I don't know. Did that seem like an answer, Luna? You can email me if you want to talk.
Like a goodie answered me. Okay, I want to say thank you to everybody, especially to Sarah, David, and Amy. You guys were amazing. This might be the longest literary Modiin event we've ever had, so thank you. And thanks to everybody who was on the line. And go out and buy their books if you haven't bought them already, and read them. And really important, please write reviews. Everybody needs reviews on Amazon. Even if you don't buy on Amazon, we need reviews on Amazon or Goodreads or wherever you buy your books. And I'm sure that everybody here would be very happy to meet with book clubs. So if you run a book club, let our authors know. And that's it. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Julie, it was so great.
Thank you, everyone.
Stay healthy.
Bye.
Bye, guys.